Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal and assistant superintendent and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. I don't think I've ever written or talked about Civil War Day. This is a day in my former school district where 3 elementary schools would go out to a place outside of town that actually was a Civil War battlefield, and they would reenact a Civil War battle. Now, you might be thinking, that doesn't sound so bad. I'm sure there were some components that had history, come to life for the children. Yeah, that's true. And the kids did learn about how food was prepared, and they learned about medical treatment. There were some children assigned to be reporters, and so they learned how battles were covered, for instance. So, yeah, But I have to tell you, I was so uneasy about Civil War Day. I mean, first, kids were allowed to choose which uniform they wanted to wear. Yes, there were African-American soldiers in the Confederacy, but I remember, this one kid asked me, "Hey, should I wear gray or blue?" And I was like, Union blue. I remember going to this hill where the battle took place, and it had a wooded creek at the bottom of the hill, and then this wide open space at the top. And I listened to a local historian explain what had happened in this place. Union soldiers were pursuing Confederate soldiers down the hill. Union soldiers were relatively new. They had just gotten off a train, and they had arrived in the area. They didn't know the terrain, and really, as the story was being told, it seemed like it was suggested they didn't have a lot of training to begin with. And so there they are. They're running down this hill. They kept shooting over the heads of the Confederate soldiers, and at this point, they found themselves at the bottom of the hill, out of breath and out of ammunition. The Confederate soldiers emerged from the wooded creek at the bottom of that hill, and they slaughtered the Union soldiers. That was the battle. At this point, I interrupted and I just said, I wonder, will there be any mention of the horrors of war? Or that brothers fought against brothers, families were split, a house divided cannot stand, any of that? And the local historian looked at me and he said, I remember this, you're not from around here. We could speculate what he was really asking me, but that's not the reason why I tell you this story. I remember going back to my office, and I remember declaring, we have to end Civil War Day. And I was stunned by the reluctance to end something that had been part of the district's history for generations. My guest today is going to tell you about what happens when you mess with deeply rooted traditions and practices. In leadership, if you're going to shift the organization, you must consider the unintended consequences of any decision. And then you chart your path to change in a thoughtful and deliberate way. As my guest Nate Levenson reminds me in our conversation, you can't take the politics out of the superintendency. Thanks for listening. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Nate Levenson is my guest. Nate is a former superintendent from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He's president of New Solutions K12 and an author. Most recently, he published 6 Shifts to Improve Special Education and Other Interventions by Harvard Education Press. Nate, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
It's great to be here, Peter.
So Nate, it's so nice to see you. And for those who are in the listening audience, I should say that my invitation to you to be a guest was not a cold call. I met you at a conference really just at the right time. I was making a transition in my leadership approach, sort of better aligning my actions with my beliefs, and really was looking for a way to engage in high or higher levels of collaboration throughout our organization, especially when it came to budgeting. And then I met you, and then I read your book, Smarter Budgets, Smarter Schools, which I have here in the background in case anyone who may see any video of this will see. But it was that book that really helped me kind of understand what I needed in terms of where I was falling short. And so I asked you if you'd work with our organization to help us make better decisions. And we did this in advance of any real budget woes. We just saw on the horizon that something was coming, that we were going to have a sense of urgency. And so we sought your advice. So I wonder, would you take a moment just to talk about the book, Smarter Budgets, Smarter Schools, how you came to write it, and then what prompted you to then write a standalone book about special education and interventions?
So Smarter Budgets, Smarter Schools really came at this question, as a superintendent, as a school board member for 6 years as well. Everybody wrestles with budgets. But then it dawned on me that actually everybody does not wrestle with budgets. Superintendents do, CFOs do, and then everybody else wrestles with the superintendent and the CFO. That in most school districts, by plan actually, I just hear like the superintendent saying, I don't want to take the principals out of their building. I don't want them to have to wrestle with this stuff. They've got to focus on their kids. But if you believe the budget is a strategic lever for dramatically raising achievement, which I do, I've always believed, and a lot of research will prove, that how you spend your money matters more than how much money you spend. Definitely easier to have more money than less, but you can waste a lot of money and you can spend small budgets really well. But so the question is, if you want to spend your money in the most impactful way, you could think, as I did initially, hey, we'll get some smart people in a room, we will map it out, we will do analysis, we will make a really smart budget. Then you present it with fanfare, and everybody craps on it. Everybody who lost a single person, a single tenth of a person, the person whose budget didn't go up as much as their neighbor's budget, everybody attacks you. And quite honestly, at the end of the day, you end up with across-the-board cuts, or everybody gets the same amount, and that's the opposite of a strategic budget. And so I just came to learn that if you're going to spend money really, really well, you need a lot of support. You need the political support for it, not just the analytical support. And nobody ever supports a budget that they didn't help build. And so as a result, bringing principals and others into those hard decisions really helps you get over the finish line.
I could imagine you also began having conversations with districts, and this is where I'd like you to talk a little bit about your newer book about special education, because it is a big part of one's budget, particularly in metropolitan or urban districts, suburban districts too, I imagine. And there is less money coming in from the federal government in terms of required services and accommodations that need to be met. And lots of districts will find ways to sort of put in additional paraprofessionals to sort of solve a problem quickly without thinking about the unintended consequences, what that means for one's budget long term. And so would you talk a little bit about that book?
Yeah. So special education is this classic lose, lose, lose scenario in most districts. And what I mean by that is, let's start with the kids are not doing well. There are entire states in which 10 or 11% of the kids with disabilities are reading on grade level. So we know the kids are not doing well, but we're spending a fortune, and we spend more every year. I had a district that had this massive budget cut. They cut 480 general education positions and added 32 special educators and paraprofessionals in the same year. But they're still in single digits proficiency for kids with special needs. So this is an example of more money isn't the solution. And yet we keep throwing more and more bodies at it. And so I went and studied the highest performing school systems where the kids with special needs dramatically outperformed their peers in the state. And in one district, the kids with special needs outperformed general education kids in the state. And when you go and look at what they do, two things turned out to be true. One, their practices are different, and those practices cost a lot less than the traditional practices that were getting much worse results. So it really took some of the discussion that I had in Smarter Schools, Smarter Budgets, and really devoted an entire book to the question of how do you raise achievement for kids with disabilities. And the good news was it didn't cost more money.
So we certainly want people to read the book. I wonder, would you reveal at least one example that you did notice?
Sure. Really, so the top three ideas, I'll say them quickly because they are a package, is you need to focus on core instruction first. And too many school systems think, hey, special ed will solve the problem. So investments in high quality coaching, investments in high quality curriculum really improve core instruction. The second is you need to give kids who struggle more time to learn, which means some very costly programs like co-teaching. They give you 2 adults, but they don't give you twice as much time to learn. So giving kids extra time to learn matters a lot. And then lastly, the person helping with that extra instruction has to really know their content. They need to be what we call content strong teachers. And yet we've been moving away from that. We have 300,000 more paraprofessionals working in our schools today than we did a decade ago. Paraprofessionals are not highly skilled teachers. Most of them are not teachers at all. And it doesn't matter how many paras you hire. Johnny is not going to learn to read. And we need to hire fewer people who are skilled reading teachers.
Thank you. You know, in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension called nested patterns. And nested patterns really is sort of the muscle of the work of an organization. It almost speaks to your values or just how we behave. And inside that dimension is a term, high levels of collaboration and shared leadership. When our organization worked with you, we brought everyone into the conversation. So you talked earlier about how budgets often are led by the CFO and the superintendent who bring it to the school board, and then they bring it to the organization, and then everybody, in your words, craps on it. And that certainly has been our experience in the past. And so we brought you in and you gave us a new way of doing things. You put them to work too. In collaborative teams, they had to wrestle with programs and personnel, with one-time spending and long-term investments. And each item had something called karma points attached to them. Would you tell us a little bit about this process, why it's important, and how collaborative processes yield more predictably successful results?
Sure. When it comes to budgeting, the collaboration is really helpful on 2 fronts. So on the figuring out what to do front, principals, teacher leaders, they are closer to the front line. So I value their opinion a lot. But they're also really, really far away from taking a district perspective. And so generally, I didn't want them at the table because they were just advocating for their building. They just wanted more. And so when I was a superintendent and I'd run out of political capital and had another budget to balance, we had 15 ideas to consider to invest and to balance the budget. And I presented my options and the principals crapped on it. And I said, fine, you balance the budget. And I gave them a list. And I said, you don't get to leave the room until you have chosen enough cuts and enough investments till we have a balanced budget. And they howled. They said, it's not my job. They said, this is really hard. They said, and one of them said, I would never in good conscience cut anything. I said, but that's our job. And no, the cuts are coming. So either I do it alone or you actually help. They left the room steaming. They came back 2 weeks later. It took them like 7 hours to choose from the list, but they made good choices, some that I would not have made, and put some new ideas on the table as well. So that was the first reason. Their collaboration, they brought a perspective I couldn't have from the central office. Equally importantly, by going through that process, like we did with your folks, they wrestled with it, and now they owned it. So when I presented these solutions, first of all, I didn't present them, I had them present them to the board. But much more importantly, when the teachers swarmed them the next day, instead of saying, yeah, Nate's an ass, I can't believe he's cutting this, they actually said, well, this stinks, but this is the best solution from a bunch of bad ones. We wrestled with it. We cannot think of anything else to do. You have no idea how hard a decision this was. Well, they knew it was hard because they had to help make it. And we did pass a budget, and we closed our achievement gap between general ed and special ed by 40 points. We reduced the number of kids who struggled in reading by 2/3. The budget was shrinking, but the collaborative process gave us both the right answer and the political clout to implement the right answer.
Without giving away too much of what you bring to the process, that idea of karma points was just a revelation for us to understand that sometimes you make decisions, and if you don't consider the politics involved in making that decision, you may make the very best decision with every good reason, and it may just sort of explode in your face. And so I thought that was a really important piece of that work. And I won't talk too much about it. If people are interested in learning more about it, they should reach out to you. But it really was for us, we can make decisions, but we considered the emotional toll that might take on the organization.
Yeah, it is a mistake to separate budgets from politics. They are very connected, and I don't say that in a cynical way. It's just a need that needs to be navigated.
Nate, I ask this question of every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Well, I hate to admit this, but I will. This seems like the kind of show where one has to do a little bearing of. I've written 6 books, and I would like to say in most of the books, I am the protagonist who had the brilliant idea, the brilliant solution, and hey, here's what I did, and here's how it worked. I will say that in quite a few of the chapters, I am in fact the example of what not to do. I am a pretty good learner. I am reasonably smart because I've made so many mistakes along the way, and I'm fairly good at not making them a second time and understanding why they didn't go right. But in many of my books, including Smarter Budget, Smarter Schools, I am the what not to do story. And far smarter colleagues from other districts are the what to do story.
An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Nate Levenson, president of New Solutions K12. He's a former superintendent and an author. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. So Nate, what happened?
This seemed like, first of all, a simple and easy decision. I will say an obvious decision. It also was one that was maybe the most researched I've ever done in my professional career. And it blew up so badly. And then even when it blew up and I knew I had lost and stepped in it completely, I did not realize that 3 years later, it would actually lead to me being fired. So here's the story. I start as superintendent. I was a non-traditional superintendent. It was my first full-time job in public education was as a superintendent, clearly hired as a change agent. And I'm a listener, so I went and interviewed each school board member first week. And at the end of every interview, asked one question. If I change just one thing, what is one thing you would like to see changed? And 6 out of 7 of them said you have to deal with the crossing guards. It is an affront to the public, it is an affront to our budget. It's just an affront and it can't continue to persist. Now this surprised me, given that 2/3 of our kids didn't read on grade level. We had had more special ed complaints to the Department of Ed than any other district in Massachusetts other than Boston, which was 10 times our size. And yet the crossing guards, 6 out of 7, said you got to deal with it. So I do a little bit of research and whoa, it is kind of weird. We've got, I think, 32 crossing guards. And they're paid quite a lot of money. I think it comes to $40, $50, $60 an hour, where paraprofessionals in our school were making $11.50 at the time. But what was probably more upsetting to people was that when it rained, they sat in their car. And when it snowed, they didn't come to work at all, but still got paid. And then we found out we had a half-time director of crossing guards who made another 40, 50, 60,000. And we had laid off art teachers and we're scaling back services. And And then there was this rumor, which I knew could not be true. You know how rumors spread, and you say it enough times, people believe it, but everybody kept telling me that, most of the crossing guards, they don't cross any students. And we're in a town in which we don't have buses to school, so 100% of the kids walk. So I knew that was not true. But everybody kept saying it. And so I'm a methodical guy, and I knew this was an important decision because it had been hanging around for a while. So I find that two folks who live in town are professional transportation consultants who do traffic pattern and walking patterns. And they actually agree to work pro bono for us.
That's great.
We ended up setting up a study in which we had two observers, not one, but two, so they could validate each other.
You weren't doing a stakeout? This wasn't, Leveson stakeout?
No, I did not do it myself, but we had independent observers overseen by these professionals so we counted how many kids were crossed in the morning and the afternoon at every location, on a sunny day and on a rainy day. And then we had the independent consultants collate the data. And it turns out it was so much worse than we ever imagined. Yes, it was true that almost everybody was in their car when it rained, and 1/3 of the crossing guards crossed 0 students, that kids actually walked to another intersection so they could cross without them, or we had entire routes in which every student walking to school had a parent with them. And weirdly enough, the 8 most dangerous intersections had no crossing guards because, quote, they told me, oh, it's too dangerous, we don't want to be there. So I figured, armed with all of this and the chief of police endorsing the plan, we said we would reduce their hours. Nobody would be fired, but would reduce their hours to only the time in which kids were walking. We would move them to the locations where the kids walked, including the more dangerous places. And the school board was thrilled. Seemed like a very logical solution. Forgot to check the karma points, which happened to be like -1 billion. Turns out the crossing guards, one had been in the role for some of them 30 and 40 years. All of them highly connected. It turns out you couldn't get this plum job unless you were really good friends with somebody who was important in town. And most importantly, I was hired by the school board as an outsider because they wanted change. But it turned out that only 51% of the town wanted change. The 49% who had lived there much longer liked things just the way they were. And the crossing guards were just a symbol of, hey, are we a jobs organization or not? And turns out that one of the friends of the crossing guards was the deputy chief of police, and another friend was the state senator. Move ahead, we have 300 people coming to school board meetings, kind of a deputy police commissioner shouting, children will die, on a regular basis. So clearly the school board does not vote to move forward on this. Move ahead 2 more years, they actually unionize with the help of the state senator, so we have the only unionized crossing guards in the state. And then worst of all, in a $55 million budget, this would have saved me $32,000. It was just stupid in every way, shape, and form.
So one of the things we ask our guests is to kind of begin considering what got overlooked. It sounds fairly clear that in this case, what got overlooked was you were attending to the relationship you had with your board members who said, we've got to solve this problem. As you laid out this scenario for all of us, we can see why this is a problem. And it appears that what got overlooked is, in terms of your overall budget, this was somewhat inconsequential, and there could have been maybe some other efforts taken to resolve what seemed to be a big problem for these board members. Would you add anything to what got overlooked?
I think what I overlooked, all of that for sure, Peter, but also I should have seen the bigger picture was a town in civil war. There were the new folks in town and the old folks in town. Turns out the school board was all the new folks, and I was, quote, their guy. And the old folks were still pretty darn mad about it. And the new folks had just the barest of majority. Even though they were 100% of the school board, they appeared to be about 51% of the body politic.
Got it.
And so I didn't realize that I was hearing from exclusively one camp, because I did not intentionally go to war or enter a civil war. My job as superintendent was and intended to serve everybody in town, but I didn't. I really got completely aligned with one camp.
When any of us enter the superintendency, we begin to learn about the legacies and the traditions and all of those rituals that make that place special. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those legacies are ugly legacies, and we have to think long term, how might I shift those things? Mm-hmm. Other times we enter and we have a sense of urgency in our minds, or at least we feel directed by our employers, the board, to make decisions quickly. And it sounds like that was certainly your situation. As you learned about relationships, what new relationships were formed, or what did you learn about relationships?
What I learned was you need to make relationships not just with the people who like you. And clearly I came with a plan, a vision. It was so pleasurable to be around the board and to be around school and district leaders who said, Nate, you're right. This is what we need to do. I knew I had best practice research on my side, and it was easy to spend a lot of time with the people who supported the direction. I did not spend nearly enough time with the people who hated the direction. And I needed to. They were important people. They were thoughtful people. I still believe my plan was way better, and ultimately, the results, the academic results, came from the plan. But I spent most of my time with the folks who agreed with me, and not nearly enough time, and built very few truly, honest, close relationships with the opposition, and ultimately the opposition won.
Would you say that was your largest frustration? Typically, I ask, what frustrated you?
I'm more frustrated with myself than with them. This was preventable. This was a self-inflicted wound. It's been a lot of years since I did this. I've often wondered, what would I have done differently? Was this a mistake? And on one hand, it clearly was a mistake, because I advise every superintendent to not do something as dumb as this, to really pick your battles. There wasn't enough money at stake. It just shouldn't have made the top 100 list of things to do. And I also realized that, and as I think of many superintendents who have been done in by a single decision, they're almost always small decisions in the scheme of things. I have a colleague who just lost her job, a fabulous superintendent who fired a soccer coach. The soccer coach is never going to be the most important person in the life of 10,000 kids who are struggling to read and enter the middle class. But it became an issue. You get wrapped up into it. You got right and righteousness on your side, but you don't have the public on your side, and it just wasn't important enough anyhow.
That is a story that we hear all the time, whether it's a swim coach, a soccer coach, a football coach. They went to that high school, they were on the state championship team, they were an assistant, then they became the coach. They know all the families, if it's a largely stable community where families have been in that community for a long time, their children played alongside with them, and they're so excited that, all of that, right? And it doesn't matter that the person has been abusive to children, is not following the tenets of positive coaching and all those kinds of things. As you can see, you've sort of tapped into something that I have some familiarity with, and that is so true. It can be the thing that absolutely undermines everything you're trying to do.
And then the other thing that was just really just such a bad calculation, and I blame in part, I did spend half my life in the private sector, and in the private sector, if you've got a really good idea and you've got facts on your side, that carries the day a lot. I so believed that having an independent consultant and having these charts and tables that showed 0 children being crossed, that people would say, whoa, we should not be spending money on crossing 0 children, and we should not allow the 8 busiest intersections to go unwatched. And I thought that data would be really persuasive. And what people heard was, I like her and you don't. And I said, but no kids are being, and I'm like, I'm quoting data, and they're saying, you don't like these people, and we do, Nate. And it was just, data should inform decisions, but it does not persuade people. The persuasion is a different process.
Persuasion relies on a different part of anyone's leadership model, particularly this idea of the power of language, story, framing, metaphor, any of those pieces that really help others see what you see in that data. But yeah, it is definitely true in my own experiences and those I've talked with around the country that the superintendency is, you're a storyteller. You have to use that data to tell your story, but more than anything, you're a storyteller. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience? I know, you're like, what? Did you just listen to the question? Or are you reading your scripts? People
well, I will say that.
But think about it.
A few things. It is funny. So in my first book on managing finances, it was mostly a technical book. The second book really became the politics of how to manage school finances. And as a result of this really blowing up, I spent a number of years identifying and studying the most politically astute superintendents, people who were able to move large sums of money and do it in a way in which people were comfortable with or even happy with, who were more aggressive than I was in how much they were shifting, but they had calm and longevity, which I did not. So it told me that there's a huge skill I am missing. I spent a bunch of years finding it and have spent the last 15 years helping others learn from my mistakes. So I think it helped a lot of other people in their superintendencies.
I certainly can speak as a beneficiary of your wisdom. So while I am sorry that you had to go through that, I have to imagine that the universe would not have connected us had it not happened. So.
That is, I'm sure, true.
What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
I love that question because I know some people hear the story of the crossing guards or read some of my books and say, whoa, this budget stuff's really hard, dangerous, in fact, radioactive, like it can blow up on you. And people, too many superintendents and aspiring superintendents say to themselves, I'll never do that. And what they really mean is, I will not use the budget in a bold and big way. I will continue programs, I will cut across the board because nobody can get mad at you. And that's the exact wrong lesson. Because kids, if we're going to dramatically raise achievement and catch kids up from the pandemic, we have to spend money very differently. But the message isn't stick with the status quo. The message is we do need to use our money differently, but we need to think of that as both a technical problem of how best to use the money and an adaptive problem of how to bring people along so that they're okay with the changes and never assume that just because it's right and righteous that everybody's going to go along with you. They don't. But don't be too scared of it either. Just be thoughtful about it.
My guest again was Nate Levenson. And Nate, I have really treasured knowing you. And for those of you who want to know more about Nate, I'd encourage you to read his books, his articles. I really enjoyed Different Leadership for a Different Time. Attend his sessions at conferences, reach out to him at new Solutions K12. And truly, I just look forward to crossing paths with you again soon.
Thanks so much, Peter. My pleasure.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action.